Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. One word that occurs in our source text for Norse mythology without a lot of clarification, but that has engendered a lot of speculation, as so many of these do, is the word Dís, plural Dísir, a term for some kind of female supernatural being that is lower than the gods, at least the Æsir, the leading group of the Norse gods. So in this video I'm going to look at some of the very, very little information that's available about these beings, and then hopefully conclude with a discussion with my colleague Dr. Luke Gorton at the University of New Mexico about some classical parallels with these kind of lesser beings, or even you could think of them as a Norse equivalent of the Fae or something like that. So this word Dís is in fact the Old Norse cognate of Greek theos, ancient Greek theos. I should always say ancient Greek because people do this thing about Greek, ancient Greek, exactly like with Icelandic and Old Norse. I think they're identical. I guess the actual ancient Greek pronunciation is theos. Anyway, also, so that's the Greek word for God. Also Latin fanum, which is a sacred place, and even Armenian dik, which is a word for pagan gods in that language. Kind of an archaic word in Armenian, I understand. So it's a word that goes back to an Indo-European root for some kind of object of veneration, presumably a god. But it's not our normal word for the gods in Old Norse, and it's never used, or I may be wrong, but I don't believe it's ever collectively used of the Æsir gods, or used in the singular of any particular Olasinya, female goddess of the Æsir. But clearly these beings, whoever exactly they were venerated. We do find them in place names, particularly in Sweden, place names such as Dísaberg, the like hill of the Dísir, this Dísavid, the wood of the Dísir, that kind of thing. And we see mentions of them in men's nicknames, at least. Thorbjorn Dísarskald was a Viking Age skald or court poet who had the nickname Dísarskald, so skald of the Dísir, of a Dísir. I guess it's singular possessive there. How he got that name, we don't really know. There's no poem preserved by him that talks about a Dís, but apparently he must have composed one. And it's interesting to note just how common this Dís element is in women's names. We have some very common women's names. Thordís, Thor, Dís, Hair, Dís, Army, Dís, Dís, probably something like good luck, Dís. I don't know what that was, could have been an avalanche. Yo Dís, horse Dís, using a very old word for horse. And probably the most prominent place where the Dísir actually come up in a story in our written Old Norse literature is in a little episode in the so-called greatest saga of Ola Saga Tryggvasonar. This episode is called Þiðrandi Þáttur og Þórhals, the short story of Þiðrandi and Thorhallr. And in this little episode, a fellow named Þiðrandi, very popular, good guy, wakes up at night hearing some noises outside, and he thinks it must be wanderers in the wilderness who are going to need some hospitality. Nobody else is waking up to these noises, and he thinks it's kind of a shame because someone should let these people in and give them some hospitality. It's a central tenet of Norse culture. We see that the very first few stanzas of Hávamál. And he goes outside to invite whoever might be out there in, and he sees 9 women riding in black clothes with drawn swords from the north. And I should mention that this is actually black, svartur, not blue, blår, which does mean blue. See, lots of things I've written and made videos at this point, but it's black, not blue. And then to his south, he sees 9 other women riding, and they're dressed in white on white horses. So Thithrandi, seeing this odd sight, he wants to go inside and tell the others about it, but before he can, the women dressed in black catch up with him and they attack him. Although we read that han vardisk drengelega, he defended himself like a dranger. Now, the others wake up, or some of them do anyway. Thorhallr wakes up and goes outside in a surprisingly kind of described landscape. Often our Old Norse sagas don't really describe the landscape very much, but we get a pretty picture of a bright, moonlit, frosted night. Anyway, he finds a wounded Thithrandi on the ground. Thithrandi tells him his story and then dies. And then later he's högd there, buried in a burial mound at heathenum siv, in accordance with heathen manners, heathen rites. And Thorhallr later interprets Thithrandi's night vision as a fight between his family's good and bad Dísir or fylgjur. These words seem to be used interchangeably pretty often, and Thorhallr uses them interchangeably here, saying that the bad Dísir know that a change of religion is about to come, and they want to claim one last good member of the family before the Christian church prevents them from doing that. But the good Dísir are sympathetic to Christianity and want to protect him. So notice that that's interesting because it gives this notion that in a sense your Dísir, these lesser beings, could be Christian or Christian sympathetic, right? They're not gods in the same sense. There's nothing to preclude them in a Christian understanding of the world, at least this particular medieval Norse understanding of Christian understanding of the world. They seem to have some kind of particular association with one family that might make them a little bit like Lares and Penates in a classical understanding. Again, hope to, in this video, talking to Luke Gorton about a little bit of that. And they seem to be only kind of vaguely distinguished from other supernatural beings. By the way, it's striking that this story about Thithrandi was pretty well known. In Jarl Saga, we even read about a reference to Thithrandi saw dropu Dísir, Thithrandi who was killed by the Dísir. So notice how similar this conception of Dísir seems to be, well, first of all, to fylgjur, which are these beings that follow family lines and are often in the shape of women or animals. They seem to be kind of protected beings. Certainly the good Dísir that Thithrandi has would be like his fylgjurs, protective women. And also similar to Valkyries, right? Because these women are armed, they're claiming a man who's dying in battle. And also similar to Norns, at least Norns is understood in, for example, Fafnismal or the Prose Edda, where there's not just 3 of them, but for example, as Hor, High One, Odin says in the Prose Edda, Góðar Nornir og vel ættaðar skapa góðan alder, en þeir menn fyrir ósköpum verða þó valda því illar Nornir. Right? Good Norns and from a good family shape a good lifetime, but men who die in bad circumstances because of bad luck, bad Norns cause that. So there's good Norns and bad Norns, just like it looks like there's good Dísir and bad Dísir. Also notable that in Gudrun og Kutha 1 of the Poetic Edda, we do read of Valkyries as Herjans Dísir, i.e. Odin's Dísir. And Vanir goddesses like Freyja and Skadi are called Dísir, right? So Freyja is Vana Dís, she's the Dís of the Vanir gods. Skadi is Ondr Dís, Dís of, ski, the snowshoe. Just get along well here in Breckenridge, Colorado. But the term seems unusable for an Ásynja, right, for an Aesir goddess. We don't see it used of Frigg or Idun. Possibly there's something out there that I'm not thinking of, but I've never seen a reference to them as a Dís. It's something lower than the Aesir. But keep in mind that the medieval Norse don't have a monster manual, right? They don't have stats for each one of these different things like people want today. They want to say, Dís is this, Valkyrie is this, Norn is this, Witch is this, Fylgja is this. I really don't think medieval Icelanders thought that way. I think that in the exact same way that if you ask people today, what's an extraterrestrial, right? What's an alien? You'll get a lot of different answers that won't be mutually compatible. People have different pictures in their heads. They have different notions of how different these different terms are, and maybe they think of them as kind of all terms for one thing, the same way somebody today might think of, alien, extraterrestrial as a term for like something that looks kind of human, something that looks kind of bug-headed, something that looks kind of reptilian or whatever. I think that people were capable of carrying all these notions around in their heads at once, with these names potentially being pretty interchangeable, certainly for people who are less interested about it. And that we have to be ready to accept that and not to try to put our 21st century categorization happy language onto it. There is, of course, a record of an event called a Dísablót. This is a bloat is a instance of sacrifice, so pagan religious rite for the Dísir. This is mentioned enough times that it's surely a real thing. Snorri's Ynglinga saga mentions a King Adils who dies, quote, at Dísablóti, ok reið hesti Dísar salin, so he dies at the Dísablót when he rode a horse around the hall of a Dís, singular. So there was potentially a hall, some kind of small temple, shrine that one might make for a Dís, perhaps a local minor goddess or one's family's protective goddess. And then Egil saga also mentions a Dísablót, ok vartar veitsla in betsta ok drukja mikil, so sacrifice for the Dísir, and that was the best feast and great drinking, unsurprisingly for Norse religious events. And of course that's something that Eiríkur Blóðugs, king of Norway, and his queen, the witch Gunnhildur, attend. That's actually where Gunnhildur tries to poison Egil, sort of famous event in his saga where he carves runes on a drinking horn that contains poison in order to bust open that horn and not be poisoned. And Vígaglúm saga, a fairly late saga, says Þáttvar Veitsla búin at veturnóttum og gert Dísablót og allir skulu þessa minning gera. So a feast was prepared at the winter nights, and Dísablót was made, and everyone was supposed to do this remembrance. So perhaps if it's a remembrance, we're associating Dísir with perhaps fallen family members who become these posthumous, like guardian angel figures for a family. I think that's a plausible interpretation of how at least some people might have taken the Dísir. By the way, winter nights, that would be at the beginning of winter, and the Norse conception where summer and winter split the year, and there's spring and fall are not necessary divisions of the year. In 2024, winter will begin on October 28th, for example, so these Dísablóts would be happening in the earliest days of winter, which would be, from our perspective, typically the last days of October. So there's not much out there in our Norse written sources about these Dísir beings. My job is not to try to present some cohesive picture for you. Use this information how you want, but people make up lots of information on the internet, and I do see it as my job to try to cut through some of that, tell you what's really out there, and to say, what you do with it. Like Tommy Lee Jones in The Fugitive, I don't care. but that's what's really there. So hopefully now we can go to part 2 with the discussion with Dr. Luke Gorton once he's done skiing. It's a younger man's game, and get you a little bit of a comparative view of some very similar figures in the classical world, the Lares and Penates. So for now, thank you those who read my books. Thank you to those taking my Old Norse class on Zoom. Thank you to my Patreon and Ko-Fi supporters, and from beautiful Colorado, of course, I'm wishing you all the best. Dr. Luke Gorton of Word Safari.
I'm popping up everywhere these days.
What are you doing here?
Well, I'm here to provide a little footnote to a video.
Right. So I was just talking about these beings in Norse myth called the Dísir. Now, interesting thing, that name, Dís, is actually cognate with Theos. So, potentially early on a divine being. But we
Yeah.
don't have named Dísir. They seem to be associated with particular families. There's some evidence of a cult, but it seems to be more of a sort of personal, home-based cult. And of course, analogically, I've often been tempted to think of the Lares and Penates of classical myth. So could you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah. So most people know about the major Olympian gods in Greek mythology, let's say, which as you probably know have very similar counterparts in Roman religion. But fewer people know that those were not the only gods that Romans worshipped. They did worship them. That's certainly not untrue. But they also had lower levels of gods, and many lower levels of gods. And two of those groups were called the Lares and the Penates, both of which are in the plural because, of course, it's a polytheistic system. We don't have a ton of information about the Lares and the Penates. They get mentioned offhand from time to time, so we know that they were classes of deities that were worshipped by the Romans. So there isn't as much to say about them as we would like, but I'll say what there is to say about them. Also pointing out that some things are controversial because, of course, different scholars have different opinions. But I'm going to try to give the most vanilla version here. So Lares are these deities that are usually tied to a specific place. So the idea is that there would be a lar, that's the singular, there would be the lar of a particular house. Like this building we're in it would be thought to have its own protective deity, kind of like our idea of a guardian angel today maybe, but it stays in one place and it only really protects that building, that house. There could be a lar of a neighborhood. There were lares of a whole city, like Rome, for instance. Those lares would usually they would be worshipped by, of course, the people who were living in that house, to protect the house, which kind of makes sense if you believe that there's some spiritual force that dwells on that same plot of land, that you might want to have a good relationship with it, or him or her or whatever. So you would worship the lares of the particular place that you were in. And of course, one of the reasons we might not know that much, certainly not in great detail, is that most of the families who worshipped their own lares never wrote anything down about who, what these lares might have even been named or how they would worship them. One thing we do know from both archaeological and literary evidence is that it was pretty standard to keep little statues, maybe about as maybe smaller than your hand, of the individual lares in an alcove, and that alcove was called the lararium, which is just the place for the lares essentially. And we've actually kind of set up a modern lararium for you here with whatever we happen to have at hand, which is some dishwashing soap, Bayer low dose aspirin, sponsored by Bayer.
No, it's not.
He's not getting any money for it. A little salt shaker, and whatever. That would be the kind of vibe that a lararium would have. And it would just be kind of an alcove like this, maybe further into your house. Although in the ruins of Pompeii, I understand that at least one house has a lararium right out front. Like they want to showcase their lares to everybody. But then they have a second one further in. So then they might have more personal or private deities in there. So those are the lares. They are tied to a place, and those would be worshipped by everybody who lived there, not just particular family members, not just elites who lived there. Slaves would be encouraged to worship the lares because they lived there too, and so they would also want to cultivate a good relationship with the protective minor deities who lived there. On the other hand, the Penates seem to be different. The Penates seem to be ancestor deities. So if you were living in a house, you would worship the lares who also inhabited that same space, but you would also worship your own family's Penates, who again seem to be your own family's ancestors, grandparents, great grandparents, whatever, and they, so those are two different classes of minor deities that they always mention. They often mention in tandem. They don't always mention them together, but we often mention them in tandem. Let's put it that way. The Penates would be, again, more private to the family because they're your own family's ancestors. So your slaves would not take part in the worship of the Penates, but they would take part in the worship of the Lares. If you moved houses, you would take your Penates with you because they're yours. They're your family's ancestors, but you would leave the Lares. The Lares lived there, so you would actually transfer the worship transfer your own worship to new Lares at the new house that you lived in. Whenever anyone had to move, like a young girl who got married, she would formally transfer her reverence to the new Lares of the house that she was living in because they're really very tied to specific places.
You know what this makes me think of is brownies a little bit in a traditional English conception, but even more so the domovoi in Slavic folklore. Something that becomes after Christianity more like a spirit that dwells in the house, right? And what you were saying about it being associated with a particular family, the Penates, there's a story about a man who goes outside not long before the conversion. It's late at night. He hears some noise outside. He thinks maybe there's some wanderers. And so he goes outside to see what it is. And he sees these 9 women riding from the north. They're dressed in black. And then there's 9 women riding from the south. They're dressed in white. And he thinks, what's going on? And he's
early Nazgul appearance, probably.
Actually, because it's sort of similar. But he's going to go back inside to tell the others. And the ones on the black horses catch up to him and they attack him. And another guy wakes up shortly after this and finds him and hears a story of it. And then the fellow that was attacked died. And so the fellow who's heard his story says, "Oh, that must have been the Dísir of his family, the good and the bad," which is kind of interesting. I don't know if there's good and bad Penates.
I haven't heard anything like that. Again, there's gaps in our knowledge, so I wouldn't say definitely not, but I haven't heard anything like that.
But then he says, and the bad Penates, they know that a better religion is coming.
Interesting.
And they want to make sure they get a good member of this family before they can't get any more of them. So it does seem to be implying that these Dísir are, somehow manifestations of those earlier generations of the family. But then sometimes they seem to be associated with places too. And in Old Norse, our terminology is even more confused than the classical world. We read about these landvættir, these spirits that live in the land. In fact, in the earliest heathen law code of Iceland, we read that there was a prohibition against sailing into land with the dragon head on your ship. Those things are actually removable. You can unscrew them. They kind of screw into the front of the boat. I'm not a boat person, so I don't remember what that's called. But you're supposed to take it down because it'll scare the landvættir.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I think that might be something like your Lares conception, and then these Dísir, or sometimes you see the word Hilgir associated with a particular family, more like that Penates conception. But not having names because, of course, though they might have names, like maybe people at home are like, oh yeah, that's Tommy the Lar or whatever. I don't know.
Sounds about right.
Tommius the Lar.
Yeah.
But they're not going to tell stories about this. They're not going to publish about this because nobody outside the house cares.
Yeah.
And I think the same is probably true in the Norse conception too, even more so because it's a less literate culture in a lot of ways. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you taking a moment to talk to us about this. And side note, Lares Penates etymologies.
Yeah. From what I understand, some people believe that Lares comes from the Etruscan word lar, which means like lord or something like that. I haven't looked into this enough to have an official professional opinion. I'm not publishing any scholarly articles on this anytime soon. I'm a little bit skeptical of this though, because from what I understand, in archaic Latin, the name was not lar but las. It was lases, not lares, and there's a regular sound change that happens in early Latin, I think around the 3rd century BC, where s's that are caught in the middle between vowels, intervocalic s's, they rhodicize. They undergo this pretty common sound change across languages. They go from S to Z. Lases would have been pronounced lases for a while. And then Z's are actually pretty hard to pronounce, and lots of languages try to get rid of them. And one of the normal ways to get rid of a Z is to change it to an R. So that's what happened with Lases. It became Lases and then Lares.
It's like corpus corporeal.
Yeah, the corpore is actually cognate, or the R there is actually connected to the S in corpus when it got caught between a vowel and wasn't just at the end of a word like corpus. So that makes me question the Etruscan etymology.
Yeah, sure.
Because if it really came from Lar and Etruscan, why would it have an S there ever? Again, I'm not staking out a position necessarily. I'm just a little skeptical of what seems to be the received wisdom from some internet sources that I have looked at. Let's put it that way.
Well, what would lost mean? I can't think of it.
Yeah, I mean there's a root that means shaggy, but I don't.
I think the Domovoy and brownies are often kind of shaggy.
Really, huh?
But that's probably going too far, connecting with that recent folklore stuff.
Right. Penates is one idea is that it's connected to a Latin root that means inside. The same root as in like penetrate, which means to go inside something, basically. So maybe the Penates are like the they're your family's gods. They're like they're nobody else's. They're only for people who are on the inside. So I think that could easily be the etymology of Penates, but maybe it could be something else.
They're the intimate gods.
Yeah, they're the intimate gods is really what that means.
And maybe that's really at the end of the day a nice way to think of the Dísir. They're not like the just like the Penates are not like the named Olympians. The Dísir are not like the named Asgardians, if I may borrow a Marvel phrase. Yeah. They are the intimate gods of home and family that don't get public stories told about them, but maybe had a wealth of private stories told about them.
Almost certainly.
Are just totally lost to us.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks for your time.
Absolutely. And, it's good to chat.
From beautiful Colorado, we're wishing you all the best.